Welcome everybody to Venable. For those of you in the room, it's nice to see you here live. We've got a good turnout here in the room. Equally or probably more impressively, we've got over 300 people dialing in on the webinar today, and hopefully you can all see us out there in cyberspace. So we look forward to a great presentation. To remind everyone that this is being recorded. It's our legal disclaimer. As lawyers, we have to do those things. We have many friends and clients and prospective clients and others on the phone and in the room. As many of you know, those of you who work with us, we have a leading government affairs practice, a couple of hundred lawyers here in Washington, many former government officials across all disciplines. Most recently, in the last year or two, we've had Ralph Tyler join us from the FDA, former general counsel of the FDA, Larry Norton, former general counsel of the FEC, John Bowman, who you'll hear from a little bit later, former and final head of the OTS, and Jamie Barnett, more on him in a minute, came to us from the FCC. Cybersecurity is really a natural practice area for Venable. Given all of our work in government affairs, it's just natural that we cover an issue like this, one of the leading issues of the day. We, for many years, have had a very successful privacy and data security practice and internet policy practice cutting across many diverse areas. We've had the opportunity to work with Ari over many years in those issues. We also are particularly and kind of uniquely qualified among law firms to be working in this area, given our presence in Maryland and all the action that's going on in Maryland in cybersecurity and defense. Of course, with our roots in Baltimore, offices in Rockville, and I think we still have the most, we are still the largest law firm in Maryland. In addition, several of the areas of practice, and you'll hear from them later in the second panel, we've been leaders in for many years. Transportation with Jim Burnley, former secretary. Electricity, you'll hear from various people that practice in that area. Financial services, as well as a very deep procurement practice. The final reason, I think, and probably the most important reason that Venable is qualified here is, and you'll hear this from our speakers, but cybersecurity is really going to depend on increased and significant collaboration between the private sector and the government, maybe in an unprecedented way, and that's an area that we've succeeded in for many years. There's a lot of legislation pending, as many of you know. The executive order came out after failure to reach a legislative solution, but bills have been reintroduced, and there was a hearing, a joint committee hearing in the Senate just last week. Regarding legislation, General Keith Alexander, director of the National Security Agency and the Pentagon's Cybersecurity Command Center at the time of the legislative debate last year, said, "The cyber threat is real and demands immediate action. The time to act is now. We simply cannot afford further delay." And I think you'll hear from our speakers about that. President Obama has declared cyber threat is one of the most serious economic and national security challenges we face as a nation, and that America's prosperity in the 21st century will depend on cybersecurity. So this is the first in what we hope to be a number of seminars. We're probably going to be focusing some as we go forward on particular industries and verticals, but this is kind of the initial one given the executive order. We wanted to start there because we expect many more years in this ongoing dialogue. So with that, let me introduce Jamie Barnett, our recently joined us as a partner. Admiral Barnett practices as a partner in the firm's cybersecurity practice. He's had a distinguished career in the public and private sectors. A surface warfare officer, he has over 30 years of experience in the United States Navy and Navy Reserve, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral and serving as Deputy Commander, Navy Expeditionary Combat Command, and Director of Naval Education and Training in the Pentagon. Admiral Barnett served as the Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau of the Federal Communications Commission, where he executed major cybersecurity initiatives. As chief of the Bureau, Admiral Barnett also led major rulemakings and projects in public safety, broadband, emergency alerting, and the next generation 911, working closely with industry and government stakeholders. Immediately prior to joining Venable, Admiral Barnett served as a senior vice president for national security policy at the Potomac Institute for Public Policy with a focus on cybersecurity issues. So with that, I hope you all enjoy the panel.
And in addition to being our partner in charge of the Washington, D.C. office, Stu is a nationally recognized attorney in the fields of privacy and e-commerce and marketing. And so thank you, Stu. I'd like to add my welcome to all of you here in the room and to the hundreds of people that are joining us on the web through the webinar. And I might remind the folks in the room at least that you might want to put on vibrate your cell phone unless you would like to be recognized in that way. Not a day goes by without us hearing of or seeing in the news some significant or major cyber attack, some data breach, some terrible loss of money or intellectual property or functionality. And while attempts have been made to place a dollar amount on these losses, that has really been elusive. There seems to be little doubt, however, that the losses are neither acceptable or sustainable. Some people are concerned that a cyber Pearl Harbor is inevitable or imminent. Others are concerned that we're not fully sensible to the fact that a cyber Pearl Harbor is happening now, perhaps with more lasting damage. So into the fray, in mid-February, the administration launched Executive Order 13636, entitled Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity, and its companion, Presidential Policy Directive 21. And these documents outline a three-pronged policy approach of information sharing, privacy protection, and cybersecurity standards under what would be a cybersecurity framework. The executive order basically establishes a policy approach, but an approach that does have consequences and envisions accountability. For that reason, Venable is advising our clients to monitor the process that will play out very quickly over the next few weeks in some cases and months in others, and to participate. And participation by the private sector is actually contemplated as a goal of the executive order. So we thought an excellent way to inform you and to add to the discussion about Executive Order 636 and encourage engagement was actually bring you the experts and the leaders who worked on the development of the policy, and we're pleased to have two such public servants and leaders with us today. Now, I'm going to introduce both of them at the same time, and then we'll ask them to provide their insights. I'm going to ask Ari to go first, maybe talking about the executive order, and perhaps asking Adam SEDGEWICK to talk about the NIST process for the framework, but we'll let you go wherever you want to go to on that. And then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor here and from folks viewing this online. And Jason Wool will screen the questions to make sure that we don't have duplicate questions. So Ari SCHWARTZ serves as Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of Commerce. Mr. SCHWARTZ helps run the Department of Commerce's Internet Policy Task Force, providing input on areas such as cybersecurity, privacy, identity management, and he represents the department on a range of policy-related interagency working groups. He came to the Department of Commerce from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, where he served as the Senior Internet Policy Advisor for the NIST Information Technology Laboratory. And prior to his work with the government, which is where I first knew him, Ari served for over 12 years as the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for the Center for Democracy and Technology. And while at CDT, he regularly testified before Congress. He worked with the executive branch agencies on internet policy issues. He led the Anti-Spyware Coalition. And just to let you know what a great guy and a leader we have on this, he's won the 2006 RSA and the 2010 Online Trust Alliance Awards for excellence in public policy. He's been recognized as a leader in this field by Politico, by Government Executive and Secure Computing. And then I would say on a personal note, Ari was instrumental in helping the FCC formulate and gain acceptance for the voluntary initiatives for carriers and internet service providers to combat botnets, to thwart website spoofing, and to start the process for defeating internet route hijacking. Adam SEDGEWICK serves as Senior Information By the way, raise your hand so they know who you are. Senior Information Technology Policy Advisor at NIST. In this role, Adam represents NIST on the Department of Commerce's Internet Policy Task Force and advises NIST leadership on cybersecurity issues. Previously, Adam was Senior Advisor for the Federal Chief Information Officer Council, coordinating cross-agency initiatives and assisting in the implementation of OMB policy and directives. He has served as professional staff member on the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, and he did that for 9 years, handling cybersecurity and federal information technology policy. He was also award-winning, the Fed 100 Award in 2008 for his contributions to the federal information technology community. And also on a personal note, Adam and I got to work together on some very important issues regarding communication supply chain threats and risk management, and he has been a thought leader on that subject. So I'd like to say to both of you, congratulations on the hard work on getting the executive order out, as well as I know many others worked on it. And thank you for taking time to spend with us today. And at this point, I would like to ask everybody to welcome Ari for his initial remarks.
Adam's got to update his biography because he's in Fed 100 winner this year as well. So we just found out. You know, we're here today to discuss cybersecurity and the issues that have come before us. Stu gave some quotes that I often use, actually, from General Alexander and President Obama on these issues. President Obama did mention this issue and the signing of the executive order as part of the State of the Union. And so I'll just lead with another, the third quote that I use in this front to talk about the seriousness of the threat here that we face, which is that FBI Director Mueller often has been saying that he sees cyber as the fastest growing threat to the United States and actually surpassing counterterrorism, passing counterterrorism as the #1 issue facing the nation in the very near future. He said, 6 months ago, a year to 2 years. So we're nearing that point, and I think the resources that they're putting on this front at the FBI and other areas, in other places, demonstrates that even in this current budget climate. So. As part of, when I came to the administration in 2010, there was a lot of discussion about legislation and moving forward in legislation on this front. And by May 2011, we worked to put together a legislative package on this area that covered 5 different areas. Then the Senate, because that came out of Majority Leader Reid's request from the administration to help move forward legislation, since they had so many committees with different jurisdictions that had bills on this area. They were hoping to help promote the idea of a comprehensive approach to this area because they felt since still to this day, feel that that's what's needed in this area. And so we put that together in May 2011. The Senate at that point took up their own bill that became the Lieberman-Collins bill. The House had a number of different bills that were moving forward, and just the time ran out on them, and there was actually really a major disagreement about how that should move forward and how voluntary standards in particular should be put into place. Still, to this day, I think there's a general agreement that more needs to be done through legislation. The executive order that we're going to be talking about and the implementation of it is really seen as a down payment on legislation, that it's the first steps towards moving legislation, the goals of legislation, but we only can do in an executive order that which we are already authorized to do. And I think if you look through the executive order, it is very clear what the authorities are for the different players that are taking steps. At Commerce, we've actually taken on a leading role here. It's playing up to some of the areas that we already have a lot of expertise in, but it is somewhat of a new, taking those existing authorities and bringing them into a new area and doing this in such a broad way. We've put together cybersecurity frameworks for the energy grid, for health IT, for other sectors, but doing this in a broader way is a first for us. So, and really this executive order stands on 3 pillars. One is that framework that I was mentioning, and moving that process forward to get to a program for voluntary cybersecurity protection in the critical infrastructure, and the framework being the goal to get there. Number 2 is privacy protections, making sure that we are covering privacy and civil liberties as we move forward in protecting the critical infrastructure and the internet at large. And then 3rd is the area of information sharing and promoting information sharing. I'm going to start with information sharing because I feel as though in some ways it's the area where we know it's an area we need legislation, but it's also an area where there's general agreement that more needs to be done today with the powers that we have. So the first step has been something that DHS had already been working on, and that's trying to get more private sector representatives cleared to be able to get cyber threat information and the kind of information that the government has. When we talk about information sharing, it usually runs in several different directions. So you have sharing between from the private sector to the government, sharing between the private sector, sharing from between governments, so from the federal government to state governments, and also sharing out from the federal government out to the private sector. And so the executive order focuses on those last two more than the first two, because those are things that we could do without legislation today. We can try to get more information out to the public sector. We can work with states better than we have in the past. So that we've been focused on those areas. So it expands the existing program. The second thing that it does in information sharing is to take the Enhanced Cybersecurity Services Program, which some of you in the room know as the DIB pilot, right? This is the effort to get the defense industrial base, the threat information and the signatures that are held, that the federal government has today, and get that information to service providers that then can help to protect members of the defense industrial base. We want to expand that out to other, and DHS is leading this project, but expand this out to other sectors in the critical infrastructure sphere. So that is something you'll be hearing more about, is this Enhanced Cybersecurity Services Program. We also want to be able to provide timely notification to companies when we have information that company has been a target or a victim of a cyber intrusion, another goal, and developing programs in that space as well. DHS is in charge of that piece as well. Along with this greater information sharing, as I was saying before, comes greater responsibility towards privacy and civil liberties. The executive order focuses in on ways to protect privacy, and I think it's rare to get a executive order out there that puts this kind of oversight on government ourselves, where we've taken the responsibility to say we're going to ramp up the oversight that we're doing on ourselves because we feel the threat that's in place here. It's also something that, as information sharing is done in legislation, we're going to need privacy protections there too. To do this, it incorporates the widely accepted fair information practice principles and other applicable privacy and civil liberties frameworks, and has regular assessments, mostly from the DHS Chief Privacy Officer to the federal government, but also from the PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which has just been instituted. So asking them to look into this issue as well. Next, the area that you'll be hearing most about today is the cybersecurity framework. The idea in here is to build a voluntary framework where NIST will lead the development to reduce cybersecurity risks and threats to the critical infrastructure first and foremost, but the framework will be broader than that as well. While it will be mostly aimed at critical infrastructure, it will be something that is applicable beyond the critical infrastructure as well. We recognize that a lot of work has already been done to protect cybersecurity, and that there are standards out there to protect cybersecurity that are not being implemented widely. And can we try to highlight those in ways that we haven't in the past, and do it in a way that does not burden innovation, that works with the existing system that we have. The framework's not meant to be a one-size-all fit or one-size-all technical solutions. Instead, it promotes collaborative approach, trying to encourage innovation in the space of cybersecurity into the future. We believe that the companies that are driving cybersecurity innovation and the current practices and planned initiatives can help to shape these best practices by participating and helping to build into the flexibility into this area. That framework will then lead, and Adam will talk a lot more about the framework and the details of how it's going to work, but that framework would then lead to the idea of a voluntary critical infrastructure cybersecurity program. So DHS will be identifying critical infrastructure assets. They're in the process of doing that now under the executive order. And then they will be organizing the sectors that are represented by these assets and building a program to see how those companies that are represented there can build cybersecurity, can comply with the cybersecurity framework, can take their actions and the actions that they're putting into place to comply with the cybersecurity framework, demonstrate that they put that into place. So that program will come after NIST has built the framework. The first draft of the framework is expected in 8 months. So you can start to see a little bit of a time frame laying out here where DHS is identifying assets, NIST builds the framework. That process is already underway where NIST is getting feedback. That's part of the reason we're doing these outreach events now. And then at the end of that period, a program will be built. At the end of that, the program will also look at how to further incentivize adoption. So there's some efforts underway to look at incentives, voluntary incentives, put those into place, and also recommendations for how to incentivize other kinds of adoption down the road that maybe can't be done under an executive order. The EO also calls for a review of the existing cybersecurity regulation. In some sectors, but not all, our most critical infrastructure already falls under cybersecurity regulation. So this is reaching out to existing regulators. Now, some of those regulators are independent regulators, as Jamie well knows, and some of those are under the executive branch, and the executive order asks those under the executive under presidential authority to report back, and then also lays out what could be done by independent regulators as well. And to look into the framework and how the framework could be implemented and how the program could be adopted. So while it is a voluntary program, the areas where there are already regulations in place in this space or regulatory authority in place could be impacted as well. So I think that that's generally the overview of the different pieces we're talking about here. Be happy to answer further detailed questions about any of those pieces. But we'll pass it to Adam to go into more detail about the framework.
Great, Ari, thank you so much. If y'all would help me welcome Adam SEDGEWICK now.
Thanks for having me today. I thought I'd talk just for a second about the role of NIST, why NIST was selected, and then drill down a little bit into the framework and kind of how we're scoping out the next 8 months. So when the bills that Ari had mentioned and the legislative proposal, I think, always envisioned that this really had to be a true public-private partnership, and there needed to be some sort of a mechanism for industry and government to come together and assess where the market is, what standards are out there, what are the things that industry are already doing that could be promoted more widely. I think when the White House did its listening session and did sort of further analysis, the place where it made sense and when industry said they would be most comfortable with an agency playing that role, it would be NIST. And NIST itself is part of the Department of Commerce. It's often called the technical arm of the Department of Commerce, or our director likes calling it Industries Laboratory. And it's an overall a place where you do analysis on measurement science, standards, and technology to look at and study that for ways that enhance economic security and improve our quality of life. So I think a lot of people saw NIST over the weekend because of the atomic clock and the time change, and that was where the update was occurring. And as that sort of non-regulatory technical agency, and the range of things we do, from smart grid to electronic health records to computer chips, because of that neutrality, industry has generally felt very comfortable coming and working with us. And you'll see that in the range of comments we get for the range of things that we do. So some of the documents that we put out on the FISMA side, or Federal Information Security Management Act, to which we have a specific responsibility to develop standards and guidelines for federal systems, we may get thousands of comments for those particular documents. And we take those comments in so that whatever we produce is truly reflective of the state of the market and where industry is. So what do we mean by framework, and what is this thing actually going to look like? As Ari said, we have 8 months to put this together. Our initial set of considerations was put out in a request for information, or RFI, that was formally released 2 weeks ago, but we were able to get a draft out that went out the moment that the President announced that he had signed the executive order. That RFI reflects our initial considerations of what we think a framework would look like, what we think would be helpful to achieve this goal of raising cybersecurity practices across the critical infrastructure. And we asked specific questions in 3 areas. One is about how organizations currently manage risk. The second question was about what standards and guidelines and frameworks are already out there. And then we asked a series of questions about specific industry practices, ones that we think could comprise that base set in the framework, and what are the standards and guidelines that support those things. Overall, the goal of the framework and the mission that we have in the executive order is to look at those things that can apply across the sectors. So we're going in with the idea that there are things that, regardless of the sector, will be true. We realize that there is also going to be a lot of variation, and something that might work well for the electric sector might not work well for the healthcare sector. Those differences are going to be very important for us to identify and distinguish, and that's one of the key things we're looking at throughout the RFI process. The RFI is out there now. Its comments are due April 8th. We're also looking at our first workshop on April 3rd, which will be in Gaithersburg. Our hope and expectation is that will be the last workshop that we have in Gaithersburg. We would like to, which is where the NIST headquarters are, sorry. We would like to the fullest extent possible, go out for the series of workshops we'll have throughout the 8 months so that we can be closer to particular industries and we can get a different set of participations. I don't want people to think that the RFI is the last opportunity for industry to provide comment, but it is certainly a critical piece of it because that is where we're starting from. We want to generate as many comments as possible to the RFI because then when the final framework comes out, we want to have that transparency and traceability so that we can say that those things that comprise the framework came from industry itself. What our role is as serving as conveners is to do that level of technical analysis and streamline it down. But you can expect that it's an extremely open process, and throughout the 8 months and then the year, I think you'll see us continually coming out and continually coming back with questions about scope and showing sort of where we are, so that when we hit that 8-month point, people are already reasonably comfortable with what's in the framework, and then we'll have additional time to iterate until the year's up. We also get a lot of questions about what happens after the year. Is this something that's just going to go out there and then not move? I don't think, well, one of the values we have already is that we feel that by pointing to international consensus-based standards that industry chooses how those are updated, that should mitigate that part of the problem already. But you also see you'll see a reflection from us that we see the framework as a living document and something that we'll have to work with our stakeholders to continually update. And I also think that'll be some of the questions that we'll ask throughout this 8-month period. What are the things that we need to do to set up the governance mechanism so that this is something that increasingly industry takes on and leads itself? I think that sort of summarizes things. We can generate more during the questions. I don't know, did I miss anything, Ari?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I'm sure Adam was not, for our viewers and the folks from Maryland, he was not slamming Gaithersburg.
Oh, no,
it's
not
a lovely
at all.
town.
Come anytime.
They're trying to get it out there, I understand. Well, let me ask you, and Ari, I'll start with you. And I realize that the executive order was months in the making, and I know there was probably maybe longer.
You were there when it started, right?
Yeah. So, but it is careful to avoid any term that could be interpreted as a performance standard or a regulation. It talks about a voluntary consensus-based approach to the framework. But in Section 10, doesn't Section 10 on the adoption of the framework contemplate some mandatory regulations that could be adopted even within the existing authorities?
Well, as I was saying, so if a regulator already has authority for cybersecurity and they can make that case, then they could come up with the rules themselves today. The executive order doesn't give them the ability to do that, but a lot of them have told us that they don't feel like they have the expertise, and some of them are on the record, some regulators are on the record saying we don't have the expertise, we need help in order to do this. And this process, building a framework, having a program put in place, could help to give them some sense of comfort that the work has been done, that there's some sense of expertise there. Would also give the companies in that area more certainty around how regulatory process would come out. So rather than having a regulator that does not have any experience in this area go through that process. So we feel as though that's something to look at as we move forward. That doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen. For the independent regulators, however, the president can't tell them what to do. It's completely up to them, obviously, to make these determinations. The framework could help provide them with some means to look at this issue in a way that they haven't before. Some of them have already looked into this issue in the past, so it's not, the framework isn't going to change that structure. Really, our goal is to help to build a voluntary framework and a voluntary program. And we also have to write a report on incentives that I didn't mention in 120 days. So from the commerce side of this, those are the things that we're looking at. But we are, it's got to be kept in the back of your mind that there is this potential that regulators that already have the authority can do that today.
Okay. And Adam, and Ari, I think, touched on this in his comments as well, but because it's focused on critical infrastructures, doesn't this apply mostly to large companies that are directly involved in critical infrastructures, or does it also affect smaller and mid-sized companies in a particular sector that may be contractors to the companies that do critical infrastructure work?
So
how broad is this going to be?
Yeah, well, let me comment on the question you just asked, Ari, and then because I had thought about that. Because I wanted to actually, on the front end, I think we're also addressing whatever the framework is, it has to be something that industry can take up and use. And so those questions about regulatory requirements is something that we address head on the RFI. So we're trying to get the extent of that information on the front end. And if the framework process allows us to do some level of harmonization, then you'd want that to also happen at the back end. And I think that's what part of the review in Section 10 is trying to achieve. On the scope of the framework and if it's going to be large versus small entities, if you look at the language of the executive order, it's basically just targeting critical infrastructure overall. And I think what's important to us is to create something that's very flexible. So while I think there might be parts of the executive order that are targeting larger companies, and I think part of that will be left to be seen on how the identification process goes, whatever we produce is something that is going to have to be something that applies not only across the sectors, but to different size organizations. I think we realize that that's going to be a challenge.
All right. So then making the framework, NIST has to focus on the broader set of anything that could possibly be considered critical infrastructure. Eventually, I mean, DHS is going to identify specific assets, and then we'll know large and small at that point, and then the program will be built. The program itself will be built around that what they've identified. So in some ways, that question is more left to DHS, but NIST has to take that into account as they're building the framework.
It's perfectly okay for me if you speak for DHS here. It's okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak for DHS.
So is the only way to participate in the process, you mentioned the RFI, which closes on April 8th. Is the only other way to participate through your sector coordinating councils, or what's the best way for companies and stakeholders to participate and provide input?
So we're leveraging the sector coordinating councils to the fullest extent possible. I mean, one thing that we heard, well, you have the PPD that's taking a look at the NIP process, and we also heard through the listening sessions, don't set up additional industry groups, mechanisms, bodies, and that's something that the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator repeats often. So I think that's one good way to get information. I think the NIST process is another one by responding to the RFI and coming to our workshops and reaching out to us directly. One of the reasons we were selected is because, I think we were chosen in the executive order is because they did hear from industry that they felt comfortable with our process. So I think the workshops and the RFI will be, for us, the main way to get engaged, but we certainly see ourselves traveling and speaking at CPAC events and just going out and doing events like this to kind of raise awareness and to really ask people to come and participate.
Do you know when the next workshop will be announced past April 3rd?
I think, you know, we have some notional dates. I expect that it will be announced, if not before April 3rd, at April 3rd.
I'd just say, you know, this is not one of those examples of we're from the government, we're here to help. It's we're from the government and we need your help, right? The NIST process cannot be successful if there's not leadership from industry that is identifying best practices and standards that they use in this space. We know there are leaders out there that do good work in this space, and we need them to come forward and help us put together the framework. It just will not be a successful framework if we don't get that kind of participation. So we really do need the leaders to step up and participate. We've been fortunate in the past. I mean, if you look at the smart grid work in particular, we've had such incredible participation from the energy companies in that work, and from advocates and from academics, just the widest possible a range of input, and people have been happy with that process, right? I mean, it's come out and built a framework that people point to today in a really broad sense. So that I think can serve as kind of a model of what the kind of outcome that we'd like to see. They had a longer period of time, and they had somewhat of a bigger mission in that they were talking about interoperability as much as they were talking about security. But at least it gives people a sense of the kind of process that NIST wants to, and the kind of atmosphere that NIST wants to build in this space, where the private sector does take a leading role.
All right. So, and Ari, I'll start with you on this, and we can go to Adam on it. So Section 9 of the Executive Order requires a 150-day process by the Secretary of Homeland Security to identify risk-based approach to those critical infrastructures where a cybersecurity incident would have a catastrophic regional or national impact on public health or safety, economic security, or national security. Commercial information products and commercial information technology services are exempted. But the policy purposes, implications of having your critical infrastructure designated as a greatest risk, what are those? What will happen to those companies that are designated having the greatest risk?
Well, first of all, let me say I don't think that I would disagree with the claim that the IT companies are exempted. Basically, I think it's a statement of existing policy, restatement of existing policy that the IT products are not considered to be critical infrastructure for this purpose. We said that and more in our green paper that the Commerce Department put out. Other folks in the administration have said similar things in the past. So I just think it's just a restatement of existing policy. It's not meant to be an exemption. But those that are identified, will have the structure of the program that DHS eventually will be built around those assets, right? So you're identifying that DHS is identifying assets that are critical, and then they will build a program around that, around those companies in each of the sectors where those companies are represented, using the framework that NIST builds. So that's the primary target of this, or the primary audience for that section of the EO is, how do we go about building a program? DHS's role is to build a program that can be successful in a voluntary way, working with industry to build that has been identified as critical.
And so it's more the purpose is more to create a specialized program for those critical infrastructure industries that are at the greatest risk, or is it more a prioritization of government assets of where you're going to focus first?
It's both of those things, but in terms of the program is the main goal here. And also, if you even go back to the information sharing piece, right? You have the enhanced cybersecurity services piece that's going to be coming around. That is only for critical infrastructure as identified in the order. So that's an example of the second area that you mentioned, prioritizing government government services and other efforts, tools that can be that can flow in here. So in that case, we're giving information to critical infrastructure, making sure that it works in that space, and that those companies are being protected. So that's something that those companies get out of being in that space. And we've had some companies that clearly seem to want to be identified as critical infrastructure and some that clearly do not want to be seen as being critical infrastructure. And again, it'll be up to DHS to make those determinations. So,
Adam, anything on that one? Or?
I agree with Ari.
That's good. So at this point, I may open it up to the audience here in Washington, D.C. I understand we may be under cyber attack and are not getting our questions in on the web quite as much. DDoS out there. DDoS, that's right. So we're under attack somehow or another, or the gremlins are out. But let me open up to...
it's too many people asking questions.
I think that's it. That's it. They're tripping us offline. So Randy Ford.
Ari, I guess I would direct this question to you. Given the export control responsibilities that have traditionally been resident in the Department of Commerce, there is a bureaucracy and a process for exporting sensitive technology, materials, and so forth. However, it's very bureaucratic, it takes a lot of time, and when it comes to cyber technology and solutions for challenges and threats, the cycle times don't necessarily meet the speed of the current bureaucracy for approving the export of a ship or a tank or a missile. So just as you look forward to, since networks are global and everything is interconnected and we have allies all over the world and we're all trying to cooperate, what is the thinking to speed up and make more efficient ITAR and export control and arms control, and however these things may be, these cyber tools may be defined, so that as we create solutions, we can get them out there around the world to the people that are our friends and allies.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing iterative process that we've been improving the efforts around export licensing. I would actually like to hear where people have frustrations, because in reality, I mean, this is the first time in talking about the EO that I've heard people have concern about this particular issue, where it stands today as opposed to where it stood, 10 years ago, when there were clear, very, very clear lines in that space. Today, it seems to be much more iterative in whether we can keep up with the speed. If people have some very specific concerns, I would like to hear about those in cases in particular, and then maybe we can build some sort of policy that can work beyond, based on the specific cases, as opposed to a suggestion of redoing the policy based on some more of the theoretical, et cetera. So again, I haven't heard the specific cases in this case, but it's a perfectly legitimate question, and I'd be interested in hearing more.
Other questions back here?
John Stanford with Madison Services Group. The order speaks to incentives, and obviously some of them do need to come through legislation, particularly liability protections. But for voluntary companies, it does highlight that there may be some incentives that can come straight out of the executive order. Can you speak to any of those, or what you might think what could be done without legislation in terms of incentives?
So just to make sure that it's picking up for the webinar folks, you're asking basically about incentives and what can be done with and without legislation.
So I'll talk about this to some extent and then pass that on. So one thing, I mean, we're supposed to write a report on this issue, what can be done with just through presidential action, through the existing executive order, and where do we need legislation in this space. So we will be getting to that. In fact, the time is coming. It's a very short turnaround on that. We have 120 days. And we're in the middle of putting out a notice of inquiry on that one, too. So we will be looking to you to give us feedback on where that stands. In some ways, we've already done that. We had a notice of inquiry in the past for the non-critical infrastructure space from Commerce. We had a green paper that mentioned this, and we got comments on that. So we have a good body of knowledge already, and we put together an outline based on what we've heard from those processes. And I see Larry Clinton's in the audience. He's written about this all the time. So we've been incorporating a lot of those suggestions as well, and what things that can be done in this space. I think for the most part, what industry is going to expect to see, most of it needs to be done through legislation. It's very difficult to come up with really good incentives that are outside of the legislative front. There is a mention of GSA doing a separate report for government procurement efforts, what there needs to be legislated, what they can do. That might be one area where there might be slightly more that they can do without legislation, that they really have to be the ones that look into it. But from the from our viewpoint and the things that we got in the first couple rounds in this space, things like tax incentives, the liability protections, those are things that the president can't wave a magic wand and make happen. We need Congress to pass those things.
It's an interesting thing that security costs money, insecurity costs money. There needs to be a little bit of trade-off there to make sure that we can pay for the security. Adam, did you have other things on the incentives question?
No, I mean, I would agree that a lot of this discussion will happen with our partners in the Congress. And, you know, Undersecretary Gallagher, who's also the director of NIST, testified on Thursday with Secretary Napolitano. And that was something that certainly a lot of the members were asking them a lot. I think that, you know, in addition to the work that Commerce is doing and the work that GSA and DOD are doing, there's also reports by Treasury and Homeland Security that are also due at the 120-day mark. So I think they might do an evaluation of existing programs to see if any of those could be used to support these goals. I think for the purposes of the framework, what we're trying to do is generate something that makes business sense. So it's a series of tools that you could take up and use regardless of the incentives, but we realize that incentives would make it a lot easier. Some of the folks in the standards office at NIST, basically their job is developing programs around particular incentives. So they have a pretty good sense of what they think works and doesn't, and I think that will be informative to the report that the Secretary of Commerce's office is putting together.
Other questions? Yes, sir?
How would you define the broader goal? My name is Dave, I'll go with Power Anywhere. Assuming the framework works great, and I certainly appreciate the idea of voluntary and, you know, having the industry involved and so forth. And a couple of years from now, you have all the information that you want. What's the big goal? Is the big goal when you have state-sponsored cyber terrorism that can spend $1 billion to take down the stock exchange, is the goal just to make it very expensive? Do you really think you can stop it? Can you speak a little bit to that? Because there's been very little in the press about what the overall goal is besides we're behind and we have to catch up and it's a big threat.
Yeah.
If you're going to kind of restate your understanding of that.
So the question is, I think it's a great question, by the way, is what is the long-term goal here?
How would you define
What are we trying to get to? Because we see, you know, if we get this framework, we're protecting against today's threats. There are still going to be new threats tomorrow, right? How do we, what are we trying to do here, knowing that this is, you know, basically a defensive effort? You know, my view is we see attacks today in the past 2 months, right? I'll name you the 3 attacks I've done this. People, sorry if I'm repeating myself to people that have heard me give these 3 before, in the past, but I think that it's very illustrative of what we're trying to get to in the short term. We've seen a case of the emergency broadcast system in a state that was hacked, that based on the fact that it had a default password, right, from the original from the server that came with the server, and the hackers fortunately only sent out a notice saying that the zombie apocalypse was on its way. Right? So a whole state got broadcasted that it was a zombie apocalypse. What was the reason? It was because someone had left the default password on. Right. We've seen a case of banks that have been attacked by denial of service attacks that don't have operation centers, that can't share information across their different offices to help to address some of these issues. We've seen a case of an oil company that wasn't backing up its financial data, which every small business in the world should know to do at this point, but a very large oil company was not doing that and was taken offline for weeks, basically because they did not back up their financial data and their operations data, so or weren't doing it properly. So those are basic hygiene efforts, as Jamie points out, that we could if we can get critical infrastructure to raise their game, right? And those are all critical infrastructure in the broad sense. You know, we have to see what DHS designates still, but in the broad sense, those are all critical infrastructure examples. Where if we can get those type of companies to raise their game, right? Then the bad guys, when they go around knocking on doors, as I'm sure happened in the default password case, where they were just knocking on doors, they said, "Hey, we got into the emergency broadcast system here," right? Then when those things go, when they go around knocking on the doors, they won't get into their critical infrastructure. They'll get into something else, or they'll have to raise their game as well. So this is not going to solve every problem that we have out there, but it will raise the level of protection for critical infrastructure that we have today. So we still need a lot more, and that's why I say it's a down payment on legislation and down payment on other efforts within the government. But it is something that we have to do at some point, right? It's got to be the basic level of how do we get people up to speed. And I think a lot of companies want to do the right thing, especially some of the smaller companies that they just don't know what steps they need to take and how they need to go about it. If it can be made easy, as Adam was saying, it's making this as easy as possible is our goal. In some cases, it's going to be really easy. In some cases, it may not be, but that's our goal. So, Adam, do you want to, is there anything you want?
Two more quick questions. Yes, sir.
Robert Clayton from Gonzales Saggio. On the testimony on Thursday, there was testimony by the Dow chemical representative that encouraging companies to share information that are otherwise competitive within an infrastructure space is problematic. So to that extent, what do you see within the framework that would give confidence to companies within the competitive infrastructure, let's say energy, to share information that otherwise would be proprietary and may create concerns with shareholders in terms of their own vulnerability?
So the question kind of goes to companies sharing information within the same sector is kind of problematic, and how does the framework deal with that?
So I think what we're looking for in the framework is not that same degree of information that I think the Dow Chemical person was talking about. I think he was talking more about threat information and the potential for antitrust between companies. What we're looking for in the framework is we've been talking about, is that common baseline. So we want to understand at a higher level what are the practices we're using. We're not looking for anything proprietary because we're looking for those things that sort of transcend sectors that people can take up and use. So we're not trying to have sort of a specific in terms of what the combination is to your door. We just want people to report that they have a lock. So
I think one way of talking about this is that the U.S. government is different than a lot of governments in that we first need to use private sector standards, consensus-based voluntary standards, before we go about creating our own set of standards, right? So the question here is, what are the standards that these companies, that chemical companies, that other companies are using today to protect themselves, the leading companies, and how do we get everyone up to the level of the leaders in this space rather than, that's the goal of the framework, right? So,
I know the FCC too is one model where you have companies, basically communications carriers, stuff like working together on that, so you do have to keep it a baseline. They're not sharing proprietary. So one more question, I'm sorry?
Well, I would just add, but to a certain level, the reason why they rely on industry standards is to help that level of communication among each other. Yeah. So we're leveraging that instead of creating something new.
Larry Clinton, quick question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Going back to one of the earlier questions on incentives, the question was asked: how do we know what the cost of this is going to be? Because that's what the incentives are for. The private sector is to cover that cost to do what they're doing now and within that framework. So I'm not sure I understand how we come up with the incentive model in June if the framework doesn't come until October. I mean, don't we need to know what we want the companies to do before we design incentives that are going to be powerful enough for them to do that? And some of the studies indicate there's going to be a lot of them to stop sophisticated catastrophic attacks. So why do we have the incentives program done in June when the preliminary framework isn't even done until October?
So the question was, why was this set up this way that we get 4 months to write this the incentives piece here, and then we have 8 months when the draft framework comes out? Shouldn't the incentives come after the framework so that we at least have an idea of what we're protecting? Which, you know, I would love to have more time to write the incentives report, believe me. But I do feel as though we are at the RFI asking this set of questions, specific questions about what, and getting a sense from folks about what they feel should be covered in this space. So we will have an outline, you know, hopefully as soon as early April, as to what are the types of areas that we're covering. The program won't exist that DHS is putting together, so, and that's really what the incentive structure is about, is how to build incentives for this program. But they want that incentive structure in place when the program kicks in, so that people have reasons to join the program as well. So I think we will have some sense. The idea is that we will have some sense from the first round of questions that we've put forward here about what the framework will cover, and then you can have some, from that you can have some idea of what will be asked for in a program, and then from that idea you can come up with the general areas for incentives for the president and for DHS to consider as they move forward, and to ask Congress for, since I was saying before that a lot of this is going to need legislation to happen. So if we can come up with targeted incentives pieces here that are tied directly to this program, we might be able to take that back to Congress and ask for those very specific things as part of the idea. So I think there is a chicken and egg issue with all of this, right? But this seemed like a smart way to go in terms of saying we'll have enough information to give the broader outlines and basic ideas about incentives, even if we don't have the whole program fully baked.
So immediately following this, we're going to have a sector-specific discussion about how the executive order and PPD 21 will affect things. And I know that there are a lot of people out there that had other questions. I'm sorry we're having to cut off now, but if you would help me thank Adam SCHWARTZ and Ari Schwartz for their information and work. That was great. Thank you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. We'll turn it back over to Stu Ingis.
Thanks.
Thanks, Stu.
Well, that was a very enlightening and terrific panel. Great participation and questions. I'm told that the audio portion wasn't working during my initial remarks. Come on up, guys. During my initial remarks, and so I would like to welcome the 300 people on the phone in the webcast to Venable and to our symposium. Fortunately, you were able to hear our terrific government speakers. We're about to jump over into our second panel. I'll just repeat a little of what I said earlier, but for people in the room, they don't have to hear it twice, but it dovetails nicely into our panel. Cybersecurity is really a natural for Venable, given our breadth in a number of industries, transportation, electric utilities, financial services, procurement, and then the strength of our longstanding internet, data privacy, and security practice. As I indicated, cybersecurity is going to depend on increased collaboration with the private sector, and the panelists that you're about to hear from represent the private sector in the various verticals at all levels, including on cybersecurity. The other area that I referenced earlier of Venable's strength in the cybersecurity area is our presence in Maryland, with all the cybersecurity and defense initiatives that occur in Maryland, Venable being, of course, the largest law firm in Maryland and very long-standing. So with that, I'm going to introduce one of our partners from our Baltimore office, which had been our initial office, Anthony Rosso, who represents cybersecurity companies, the cybersecurity industry on corporate issues, not as much policy, but corporate M&A, across the board, and also data companies. So I will pass this over to Anthony to introduce our Venable panel. Anthony.
For those in the room, I just need one quick second. Thanks, Stu. Good afternoon. My name's Anthony Rosso. I'm a partner in Venable's corporate practice group, and I focus most of my time representing clients on mergers and acquisitions, work a lot with technology and cybersecurity companies. I'm the co-chair of Venable's Cybersecurity Practice Group, and we'll be moderating the second panel this afternoon. The second panel will focus on the importance of the executive order to the energy, defense, financial services, and transportation industries, as well as other industries. Thanks for joining us today in person and by webinar for this panel presentation. As discussed on the first panel, the executive order initiated the process for developing cybersecurity standards, a cybersecurity framework that will apply to businesses across a series of industries, including the 4 that we've decided to focus on today. 4 of my partners, all of whom are based in our DC office and are part of our cybersecurity practice group, are the panelists for this second presentation. Brian Zimmett, sitting to my immediate right, will focus his comments on the energy industry and specifically electric utilities. Diz Locaria, sitting next to Brian, will direct his remarks regarding the defense industry. John Bowman, sitting next to Diz, will concentrate his comments on the financial services industry. and Jim Burnley, sitting to my far right, will describe how the cybersecurity standards may or may not impact the transportation industry. So we begin the second panel today with Brian Zimmett, a partner in our energy practice group. Brian has a broad range of experience in federal regulation and restructuring of electric utility industry companies. Brian provides compliance counseling to electric utilities on reliability issues and assists them in federal and regional audits and investigations. Brian also provides advice to companies in the electric industry regarding the mandatory cybersecurity regulation that's been in place since 2005 when Congress granted reliability authority to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Brian recently had an article published in Wall Street Journal Market Watch titled Cybersecurity Regulation, 5 Issues for Companies. So Brian, can you start off by describing your experience working with electric utility companies on the existing mandatory cybersecurity regulation, and then discuss what types of cybersecurity requirements are likely to apply to critical infrastructure industries as a result of the executive order?
Sure. So you heard Ari and Adam talk about the cybersecurity framework, which is basically going to be a set of standards that are going to be applicable to critical infrastructure industries. And they also talked about the fact that there already are certain cybersecurity standards out there that are applicable to certain industries. Some of my colleagues, especially John and Diz, will talk about some of the other, some of the non-electric industries that have these standards. But what I wanted to talk about today was are the standards that are applicable to the electric industry, because the electric industry is it's one of the few sectors that is currently subject to mandatory federal regulation of its cybersecurity practices, and it has been for a number of years. And those cybersecurity standards are likely to serve as a framework or a model for what you're likely to see in the cybersecurity framework that NIST is going to put in place. So, you know, these words get thrown around: framework, standards. What are we really talking about here? You know, if you're a regulatory person or a compliance person or a legal person in a company that owns or operates critical infrastructure, what are the kinds of things that you're going to have to start worrying about? Well, this is where the cyber standards that the electric industry is subject to, I think, provide somewhat of a guide for what you can expect to be worrying about in the future. So what we're talking about here are at bottom are your computer networks, the networks that you use to operate that your company uses to conduct its operations. And you're going to have to basically start thinking about, okay, well, how are these networks designed? What does your network do? Which parts of your network conduct which parts of your company's operations? Like, and what I think you'll find, and what we found in the electric sector, was that networks have been designed by IT people. They weren't designed by regulators. They weren't designed by with any real thought about future regulation. So all of these functions tend to get mixed in together on the network. But then you'll have to be thinking about things like, for example, how does your company manage access to your network? Who's got access to your network? If you were required to produce a list of who's got access to your network or which aspects of your network, could you produce such a list? Who has, and then divide that between physical access on the one hand and logical access or cyber access on the other. So who's got physical access to your network? Who's got cyber access to your network? And of the people who have cyber access to your network, could you identify what level of cyber access they have? Because not everybody has the same level of access. Some people have, read-only access. Some people have read and write access. Some people have what they call root access, which are like the system administrators. But the standards are sure to address keeping track of these kinds of issues. Another area that the standards are likely to address is what they call configuration management. That is, so your network and the elements of your network, which are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily servers, have different ports that are open and others that are closed, and certain services that are running on them. Well, which ports are open and which ports are closed? And this is a pretty complex task to figure out, because each computer has thousands and thousands of ports that can be open or closed. And when your network was originally set up by your IT people, they set it up with an eye towards making the system, generally with an eye towards making the system work and make it as easy as possible for the company to do its business. Well, when you start applying cybersecurity standards to this kind of to this question, you're really looking at the opposite of what the IT guys were looking at when they designed the network. That is, you're looking at being able to justify every single open port on your network and being able to articulate a valid business reason for having that port open. And that can be a very difficult task, especially when your IT administrators and the guys who set up your system, weren't designing it with any kind of regulatory standards in mind. Other things that you'll have to think about are things like monitoring access to your system. How do you monitor, or how does your company monitor cyber access to your system? Who's logging on? Who's got access? And then keeping logs of that kind of use. Does your company, do you have monitoring of the use of your network? If so, what kind of monitoring is it? Can you produce logs of that kind of access? Do you have intrusion detection systems? Can you distinguish between a valid user, somebody who's coming on to do legitimate business, from a hacker, someone who's managed to guess a password or somehow or through some other mechanism has managed to get onto your network to either steal things or do some other kind of mischief. And so that's another area that you'll have to worry about. Passwords. Passwords are, Ari and Adam mentioned passwords. Passwords are a big area of concern. What are your company's password policies? Again, when a lot of times when networks are set up, they're set up with an eye towards making them as easy as possible for the company's employees and contractors to use. And that sometimes means making the password requirements less onerous or as loose as possible. Well, when you make the password requirements not very strict, then that makes it easier for hackers to guess what the passwords are, or use password breaker software to get a hold of passwords and get onto your system. And if you're now going to start talking about standards that are going to be put in place, those will probably have to be tightened up. So this just gives you a sense of some of the kinds of issues that companies, that owners and operators of critical infrastructure will have to start thinking about as these new standards are adopted and put in place.
Great. So Ben, you've obviously had a lot of experience advising electric companies for a long time on mandatory cyber regulation. What can other critical infrastructure industries reasonably anticipate to be the most challenging aspects of what may come out of the executive order for them in terms of the voluntary cyber standards?
Well, when you're talking about compliance, I mean, first, I guess a word about incentives. You know, there were a couple questions about what are the incentives to comply with these. What are the incentives going to be to comply with these standards? And they were framed in the context of positive incentives. What can you do to make me, that'll reward me for complying with these things? Unfortunately, I think that while they're not going to be there's not going to be any regulatory teeth behind the standards, at least immediately, at least not until legislation is passed. There's likely to be some negative incentives for not complying, and that's, I mean, anytime the federal government comes along and decides to issue some standards governing conduct in a certain area, you potentially run into some problems if you don't comply, potential liability down the road. If you get hacked and something bad happens, we could be looking, there could be issues down the road in getting insurance if you're not compliant with these kinds of standards. And then, there could be other regulatory implications, like I know for example, the Federal Trade Commission has been in the practice of cracking down on companies that themselves have been hacked. Sort of add insult to injury, you get hacked and stuff gets stolen, and then the Federal Trade Commission comes along and tells you that your cybersecurity practices weren't up to snuff, and these standards can make those kinds of enforcement actions maybe a little bit easier. There are a series of potentially negative incentives for companies to comply. I mean, the challenges in complying with the standards largely stem from the fact, as I was saying before, that these IT networks, these computer networks, were designed not with an eye. They were designed by by IT people, and not with an eye towards meeting any kind of regulatory standards, but instead with an eye towards primarily towards making the system work and making the company's operations as smooth as possible. And so there are often, things aren't necessarily, these networks weren't necessarily designed as tightly as they could be, especially if you're looking at now measuring practices up against a set of concrete standards that you have to comply with. The ports and services issue that I mentioned earlier is an example. Again, when most of the time when your IT people have put a server in place, they aren't really looking at keeping ports closed that don't necessarily need to be open. I mean, the default is, well, we'll keep a port open if it might possibly be needed for our operations, or they'll overlook things. I mean, they might just keep a port open because they don't really think about it, or they've missed it for some reason. Now the standards come along, and if one of the standards is you have to close all ports that are not necessary for normal or emergency operations, and you have to have a business justification for every port that is open, that's, now you're looking at that can be a real headache to have to go back and take a look at how your network is configured, and do you really have a business justification for every single open port and every service that's running on your system. So one of the main challenges, maybe the main challenge, is the fact that the networks that are in existence right now that are operating were designed not with an eye towards any kind of regulatory compliance in mind, but instead with an eye towards operational issues. A second issue is the fact that there are there's a lot of software out there and a lot of networking equipment that is can't comply with certain security standards. We've seen this in the electric industry. For example, certain Windows software cannot enforce minimum password requirements, which is a real problem because a lot of the one of the main requirements in the electric standards is to have and enforce passwords of a particular length and complexity. And so if you have, let's say you've put in this software like 2 years ago and you spent a lot of money on it, millions of dollars, and you intended it to last for 10 years, well, are you now going to have to replace your installed software in order to come into full compliance? Or are you going to have or are you going to be allowed to keep your existing infrastructure in place until it served its useful life, and then switch over to something that's going to bring you into full compliance? So that's a second area I think that a lot of companies are going to have to face, and that's an issue that's going to have to be dealt with in the standard setting process.
Great, thanks, Brian. I know some of your input on behalf of your clients will definitely be helpful as that RFI process plays out. I wanted to turn to Diz Locaria, a partner in our government contracts practice group sitting next to Brian. Diz regularly advises government contractors in all aspects of working with the federal government. Many of Diz's clients are involved in the defense industry. Diz frequently represents clients in homeland security related matters and has assisted a number of clients in receiving Safety Act certification, which is the highest level of liability protection afforded under the Safety Act for providers of qualified anti-terrorism technologies. Diz is a frequent speaker and author on a wide variety of topics related to government contractor compliance matters and cybersecurity matters. So Diz, can you describe what types of cybersecurity standards are likely to apply to the defense industry coming out of the executive order, and whether those standards may move beyond the defense industry to other areas of government contracting, such as civilian information systems?
Sure. Thank you, Anthony, and thanks everyone for coming today and those on the web. Ari mentioned 3 pillars of the executive order: information sharing, privacy, and standards and best practices. 2 of those I think really apply to the defense industry and government contractors at large, or at least that I want to speak about today, and the first being information sharing. Ari mentioned that there's this identification process underway where DHS will identify critical infrastructure at the greatest risk. And if you are identified as such, you have the honor of receiving information. But as Ari mentioned, some companies don't want to get this information. Some companies don't want to be identified as critical infrastructure. And why? Because my contention, and I think the EO is elegantly drafted in this manner, is that it actually thrusts what could be completely commercial entities into a quasi-government contract type of relationship. Because what you're talking about here is companies that may or may not receive, or may receive as part of this information sharing program, unclassified information, but also classified information. Well, you can't receive classified information unless you have a security clearance. So now these companies are then thrusted into the Department of Defense's world of security clearances. That may not be something these companies are interested in. However, because they are considered great risk, they will be subject to that world and that rubric of regulation. Now, there is a process where you can appeal the decision. The executive order thought of this. It thought of a process where companies are not going to want to be considered at greatest risk for any number of reasons. Perhaps your shareholders won't want to be involved in a company that has such great risk. But bottom line is there will be an appeal process to get out of that designation. It's not sure how that'll be ferreted out in the regulations, so we'll have to see. And then the other aspect to it is that even if you are not part of this group that's lumped into greatest risk after 150 days when DHS identifies it, you're not out of the woods because they're going to do this annually. So you may fall into it one year, you might fall out of it another year. It really could be a revolving door of issues for companies that aren't in the defense industry, and now they're thrust into it because they are so lucky as to receive this classified information. And the second area being standards and best practices. This area, in terms of defense industry and in some cases civilian industry with government contractors, is already somewhat subject to regulation as it is. But they're looking to both DoD and GSA to come up with recommendations to decide whether or not there's additional ways that cybersecurity can be worked into the procurement process. Not a lot of that, to me, sounds very voluntary. If you're a government contractor and you're in the procurement world, you may be subject to cybersecurity. And chances are you might already be subject, especially if you're in the defense industry now. As many of you know, and Ari mentioned, he talked about FISMA. The Federal Information Security Management Act has been around since 2002, and it imposes certain security requirements on the defense industry and the federal agencies at large. Interestingly, though, in 2011, GAO did a review of 24 agencies, and not a single agency was identified as not having weaknesses in their meeting their FISMA requirements. So what's happened since then, DoD, and I'll talk about it in a moment, but GSA in particular has already rolled out new cybersecurity requirements to industry for IT contractors and anyone that really touches their information systems. So again, in terms of the civilian side of things, we're already seeing effects that are not voluntary, that are mandatory, and the executive order really is going, in the defense world, it's not really a question of voluntary. It will likely be mandatory in all respects. But one other point before we move on is the recent National Defense Authorization Act of 2013, which applies to the DoD contractors. Section 941 has mandatory reporting requirements now for contractors that are aware of breaches or, as they word it, successful penetrations of their systems. And so here you're looking at not only regulation, but reporting requirements to the federal government. Now, like the executive order and any regulations that come, there's a host of questions that haven't been answered in this area. With respect to the NDAA, successful penetration. What is a successful penetration? What you define as successful penetration may be completely different than what the government defines. In terms of, it talks about rapid reporting of these things. What is rapid? In the world of cyber and in the world of commercial business, rapid is much quicker than what the government moves at. However, you're going to want to be very careful in reporting things to the federal government because of the consequences. And that's another thing that the executive order hasn't talked about. And hopefully the negative incentives won't necessarily be there, but there's inevitably consequences both with respect to the government and with respect to industry and commercial, just being a commercial entity. Whether the government decides to impose certain consequences, whether your shareholders, you have information, what did you do with that information? The federal government gave you classified or unclassified information. How did you act with that information? What did you do with it? Did you disregard it? Did you not understand it? Did you know what to do with it? Those are all things that are really going to be out there for industry to figure out. And I hope the regulations really do talk about some of this and some of the incentives. And one thing Anthony mentioned is the Safety Act, whether incentives like the Safety Act could help companies limit their liability, both with respect to the federal government, but also with respect to shareholders and third parties at large. These are all issues that are out there for contractors that right now there's no real answers in the executive order.
Great. Thanks, Des. Next up is John Bowman, a partner in Venable's Financial Services Group with significant experience in the public and private sectors. Throughout his career, John has held a number of senior-level positions in the federal government, focusing on financial institutions. Prior to joining Venable, John served for 2.5 years as acting director of the Office of Thrift Supervision, supervising more than 720 federal and state chartered thrifts and 440 holding company enterprises. Prior to John's tenure as acting director of OTS, he served as deputy director and chief counsel of the OTS. Earlier in John's career, he held the position of assistant general counsel for banking and finance with the U.S. Department of Treasury, serving 5 secretaries across 3 administrations. John, you can certainly attest to the fact that the financial services regulators provide continual review of financial institutions. Do you believe there's a need for an additional separate cybersecurity certification or review of individual members of the financial services industry?
Anthony, I think you hit it right on the head. The financial services industry, which is highly regulated and is looked upon, I think, both with respect and disdain, depending upon where you are in the regulatory process for its thoroughness. But the financial services industry is probably between 25 and 30 years ahead of other segments when it comes to cybersecurity. There is in place and has been in place for an ever-improving regulatory structure under which financial institutions, their holding companies, those who provide services to those entities are subjected to on a regular basis. In some cases annually, some cases every 18 months. In fact, the regulators go so far as to, have gone so far as to put in place a rating system. I think everyone's heard of a CAMELS rating system under which financial institutions are regulated based upon their capital and asset management in particular. Well, the financial services regulators have put in place what's called the Uniform Rating System for Information Technology, which institutions that do their own IT, and that's usually dictated as much by size as anything else. Above a certain size, it's probably less expensive to do it yourself. Below that size, it's probably better to contract out to various service providers. And I won't mention any in particular, but there are a fair number out there. Those particular portions, whether it's within the institution or it is a third party, are subjected to regular examinations, usually by an interagency group. Those examinations are fairly rigorous. They look at audit practices, management practices, the ability to roll out new products, manage those products, IT products, at the end of which the particular entity is provided with what's called the URSET, which is the Uniform Reporting Statement for Information Technology. Those numbers are critical, and I think we've had discussions both in the earlier panel, questions from the audience, about incentives that could come out of or that might be a part of the framework going forward. In the financial services area, and I think Diz talked about it, call it a negative incentive, call it what you will, the ability or inability of a IT service provider or an IT shop within a financial institution to receive an acceptable URSET number can be critical for their ability to provide services to others, as well as to provide services within the organization. In talking with a number of representatives of the various financial services trade organizations here in town, as well as a number of our clients, my sense is that they are very supportive of the framework, the executive order. They believe that the structure under which they've been operating for some period of time can provide a model, but I would caution for those of us in this room and those that are listening in, it should only be a model. The burden, and I can say this as a former regulator, that the regulatory structure imposes for cybersecurity on financial institutions is considerable, both from the government's perspective as well as from the institution's perspective. Brian talked about systems that are designed not to be reviewed by or by regulators in the electric industry, and I would say that in some cases, every system, every improvement to in the cybersecurity area that financial institutions undertake, they do so with an eye on what their regulators are going to do with it when they see it for the first time, and how well it will work to provide both their customers with the financial privacy that they look for, as well as the ability of the entities to continue operations should they be subject to attack. It's a different world. It is a world in terms of cybersecurity that I think, I don't want to say it's obvious why they've developed the way they have, but people get very, very finicky when it comes to their personal information, be it financial or otherwise, being made a part of the private domain through a hack, through an attack, or some other entity. One last point I want to make, talking about contractors and others. The Securities and Exchange Commission has taken the position that for financial institutions, the hacking of their system is something that has to be reported to all their shareholders. If you look at some of the more recent 10Qs, the 10Ks that are coming out, we are starting to see on a fairly regular basis reports of, albeit very mild descriptions of, the overall impact of these kinds of activities by outsiders on financial institutions. I think that's something that we will probably see in the framework, where you will see that same kind of disclosure requirement for all instances, or all different kinds of companies. So I'll stop with that.
Well, Brian and Diz have touched on this a little bit in their specific industries, but in your industry, there are certain cybersecurity standards that are in place, and obviously other ones that are likely to come out of the executive order. What do you see as the consequences for those institutions that don't comply or don't meet the standards?
Well, again, you have in place a very formal, and by formal I mean a well-established, I'll generally call it an enforcement mechanism, both an informal enforcement actions, which are ones that the public is not generally aware of. On top of that, we have formal actions, which include cease and desist orders, directions. In the case of a third-party provider who receives a less than satisfactory rating, there is a requirement that the particular regulatory agency that examined that provider must disclose to all of the regulators of the companies that it provides services to the fact that that rating was less than satisfactory or was not up to where it should be. The consequences of that, I think, probably go without saying when it comes to the willingness of the institution's regulator to allow it to continue to work with that particular provider. But short of a public announcement of an enforcement order against an institution for this purpose, and to the best of my knowledge, and I did a little bit of research in terms of trying to find examples of public orders, the number of those orders is very, very slight. So what you will see, and what you would see in the ordinary course of things, are that the regulators overseeing a particular institution that has experienced IT issues will do so in an informal way. A board resolution, memorandum of understanding, perhaps some direction or some discussions with management regarding their continued service or other activities, remedial actions they might undertake. So it's, again, it may be a model for other kinds of activities, whether it involves losing a contract or something, which is a very, very harsh result, I understand, but given the importance that you would place upon that particular activity, it's something that financial services regulators look at and undertake on a fairly regular basis.
Okay, great. And given the historic regulation of financial services in the information systems area, do you see that that framework might prove constructive to other sectors as the cybersecurity standards are developed, either industry-specific or generally?
I would suggest that it could be, but again, I would caution, and I don't think I can say this with enough force, which is the structure under which financial institutions are regulated has been around for a long time. It is very, very intensive in terms of regulatory oversight, both from the regulator's perspective as well as the industries having to deal with and work with the regulators in doing that. I'm not certain it's needed for every sector within our economy in particular, that same level of insight, that same level of involvement by the regulator, but it certainly can provide a general outline as to the kinds of things both the industry voluntarily or otherwise and the government might be able to put in place. The last point I would make is, and I think Ari and Adam made the point, which is there's a fairly significant legislative statutory structure under which all of these activities are undertaken, including one relating to third-party providers, which give to the regulators the ability to go into those entities and basically get into their shorts, to lack of a better phrase, to do that. those were developed, again, historically, and I query whether or not we're going to see that kind of responsiveness from Congress to accomplish those same kinds of statutory advances.
Thanks, John. Our final panelist today is Jim Burnley, a partner in Venable's Legislative and Government Affairs Practice Group. Jim sitting my far right. Jim focuses his practice on government regulations, regulatory and legislative affairs, with a concentration in transportation matters. Jim held a number of senior positions with the U.S. Department of Transportation, including the roles of Deputy Secretary, General Counsel, and Secretary of Transportation. Jim also served for 5 years as Vice Chairman of the Board of Commissioners of the Virginia Port Authority. Jim is one of the nation's foremost authorities on transportation law and policy, and was recently recognized for the 2nd year in a row as the sole recipient of the Client Choice Award for Shipping and Transport in the District of Columbia by the International Law Office in Lexology. Jim, do you anticipate that the executive order will have any significant difference or impact in the world of transportation?
I do not, Anthony, and the reason is that most of the activities that the executive order seems to contemplate are already occurring in the transportation sector. You've got, in particular, cooperation and information sharing between the federal government and the operators of the transportation networks. Those devices that they've put in place for that kind of cooperation are very well established. And let me give you some examples. Last August, after nearly 2 years of work, a transportation sector working group, that's the official name of the group, not my characterization, which was composed of federal, state, and private sector members, published a study under the auspices of DHS entitled Roadmap to Secure Control Systems in the Transportation Sector. It was, as government reports go, concise, but it was also comprehensive, and it covered every mode of transportation. First, simply in a descriptive way, laying out what control systems are used in our various transportation networks today. But then laying out also a 10-year framework for each sector, again, to voluntarily improve the cybersecurity of those industrial control systems. Going all the way back to 2006, DHS established a group called the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council. And it has 20 distinct committees for 20 distinct sectors of our economy. And if I ask DHS, as the executive order does, to do an elaborate study to come up with those critical infrastructure sectors of our economy, I think the first place DHS will look is at the structure it has for this advisory council. It's already identified 20 sectors. So if you want to see whether your name's on the list, go to dhs.gov and you'll find out. Chances are very high you are on the list. And among those 20 committees, there's a transportation sector committee. It in turn has a series of subcommittees, again set up mode by mode, one for railroads, one for aviation, one for highways and trucking, et cetera. And when you look at the membership of these groups, these subcommittees as well as the full committees, the membership is quite broad. It includes people from virtually every federal agency. It includes representatives of state and local agencies, trade associations, and a lot of private companies. And as you would expect, if you think about it, the transportation cybersecurity issues that DHS already deals with tend to be dealt with first and foremost in the Transportation Security Administration. Makes sense, right? And it has been very active for years, working with state and local governments as well as the private sector. TSA conducts tabletop exercises with companies and local governments in the pipeline, railroad, and transit sectors. It's even cooperating with companies and vetting employees that are going to have access to transportation control systems. But that's not the whole picture. DHS has yet another entity already in place called the Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team. Let me do that again slowly. The Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team. And its charter says that it works with law enforcement agencies, the intelligence community, state and local governments, and the private operators of industrial control systems and international response teams to reduce risk and mitigate the effects of cybersecurity incidents. And this response team enterprise even provides training on industrial control system security, including cybersecurity. And again, by definition, the control networks in every transportation sector are industrial control systems. So transportation is front and center in terms of not just DHS, but also TSA's attention on a daily basis. Beyond that, you've got cybersecurity guidelines that have been developed by both federal agencies and nonprofit transportation groups for each transportation sector. And based on those guidelines, most sectors have certification programs of one kind or another. Now, I'm not naive enough to suggest that all is well and that transportation cybersecurity need not be a concern. Just the contrary is true. Attacks are occurring with great regularity on pipeline control systems, even on the air traffic control system. There have been attempts to penetrate it, although that is a pretty closed system. But it is clearly the case that both the public and private sectors are way ahead of the curve created by this executive order in the transportation world. So I think that's good news. That's the way we would all like for it to be, since we all depend on transportation networks in our daily lives. And by all accounts, and I've talked to some people involved in preparation for today, the collaboration is real. It's not cosmetic, it's not window dressing. And obviously, it's got to continue. So I think, again, to come back to the question, Anthony, the short answer is the executive order, as it applies to transportation systems, basically endorses and perhaps reinforces the collaboration and the efforts that are already underway.
Great. So you've generally described a pretty positive picture of the efforts of the public and private sectors to collaborate and work together to combat cyber attacks. Is there any reason those types of efforts are apparently more advanced in the transportation industry than some of the other sectors that are going to be dealt with?
Well, I mean, the obvious reason is the history of the last 12 or 13 years in this country. The cataclysmic events of 9/11 led directly to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and within that, the Transportation Security Administration. So going back more than a decade, we have had federal agencies very focused on transportation security issues, including cybersecurity issues, because they're inherent in this day and age in the security issues in transportation. I think that's the simple answer. That's why they're as far down this road as they are as a community.
Is there any specific transportation sector that you're most worried about and think where you have the greatest vulnerability?
Well, it's evolving, and the evolution, particularly on the air traffic control side, is important and needs constant attention. Today, as you know, the core of our air traffic control system are radars, and that is a pretty closed system. It's very difficult to impossible using cyber attacks to get into that system because it's just not set up that way. But we are in the midst of an agonizingly slow, long overdue fundamental transformation of air traffic control to a GPS-based system. And a big part of that picture, it's very complicated. There are nearly 100 different projects identified as a part of it. But a big part of that is making it much easier for the planes and much more reliable for the planes to communicate with the folks on the ground and vice versa. Simultaneously, the airline industry is moving towards a much more internet-based system. So inherent in this evolution in air traffic control, what has been a closed, almost impenetrable system is going to be a system that looks much like the systems in the other sectors we've already discussed, and the risks are obviously going to grow as a result. So it requires both, since it's publicly operating in this country, it requires the federal government first and foremost to be very, very attentive to that as the system is created.
Thanks, Jim. Well, we still have a bunch of people in the room, and I'm sure a number online as well. And so we'd like to take some questions from the audience.
Mark Trump, George Mason University Center for Infrastructure Protection. Thank you, first of all. This is a great kind of overview, and I appreciate the variety from the well-developed, the self-starters, the very regulated, to the, I'm not sure how we would characterize it.
The comers, yeah.
We would expect that in any level of human endeavor. Thank you for kind of a view of a snapshot of a couple of critical infrastructure sectors and then the cross-disciplinary aspects of it. I felt a pretty clear look at sort of the horizontal aspects of this, different subsectors within various sectors. How about the vertical aspect of this? I didn't hear very much discussion of supply chain aspects of this, particularly in the defense sector.
Sure.
When you get back down to the second, third, fourth tier, I know there are big concerns of this, and how do you see this executive order?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at it. It's going to apply broadly because you can't. If a prime is, an integrator subcontracts to a sub who subcontracts 3-4 tiers down, and that sub 4 tiers down is doing IT work and systems work, then that's a loophole that in the defense industry they won't allow. And so you're gonna see this flow down all the way down to companies that may not even know they're doing government work. I mean, it boils down to, at the end of the day, the federal government is going to look, and already does, to completely secure the network all the way through the supply chain. And one of the interesting cases I've worked on in the last couple of years is a company that produces hardware, IT hardware, and they manufacture some of that overseas. And they might be owned by a country that we're not in good graces with. And they look at those companies with scrutiny in terms of their cyber. Are they creating backdoors? I mean, and what are their manufacturers or subcontractor manufacturers? We've looked at that in excruciating detail, and I think we're going to continue to see that in droves.
Great. We have one other question earlier from someone in the audience that I'll ask Brian to help with. This is from Brent Helms at Total. Does the current conventional wisdom hold that companies in the E&P, refining, or petrochemicals industries will be designated as critical infrastructure?
The short answer is yes. E&P, it's not entirely clear. The others, petrochemicals and refining, I think the answer is clearly yes. Jim mentioned the sectors that have been identified by DHS, and I think refining and chemicals are definitely included in those, as would be, for example, oil and gas pipelines. Although, the pipelines themselves are probably going to be, as Jim mentioned, they're overseen by the Office of, I think it's the Office of Pipeline Safety of the Department of Transportation. So they'll probably, DOT will probably have something to say about those particular industries. But the answer is yes for petrochemicals and for refineries.
Okay, great. Other questions from the audience?
Robert Blake with to the extent that there's independent regulatory environments for the public utilities, you see within the framework a systematic baseline for PSCs developing assessments as well as outcomes in terms of auditing for their regulated entities.
So you're asking about whether you're talking about state level public service commissions, and whether they'll start
as independent regulatory
performing their own reviews. Well, you know, I mean, the electric industry has been subject to mandatory federal cybersecurity regulation for, you know, about 6 years now. As far as I know, at the state level, it's sort of been hit and miss. I mean, in concept, yes. I mean, that could be the case. I think that most state-level regulatory agencies, state PSCs, have so much on their plates otherwise, and fairly limited resources that they haven't devoted a significant amount of resources to overseeing cyber issues to date. But that could begin to change. We haven't really seen that to date, though.
Anthony, Lindsay Meyer from Venable. Just to follow up on the comment that was made before, to the extent that U.S. operations and U.S. entities have overseas operations, whether they're owned overseas as a U.S. parent to a foreign sub, looking to services provided overseas, to what extent will you imagine in the various industries that the U.S. government will seek to impose or to extend these safeguards and frameworks to their overseas operations?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I guess the question is, to the extent that the defense contractors and probably all industry with respect to cybersecurity has overseas operations, parent company or manufacturing operations, how are these standards, might they be applied to those entities overseas? I think you're going to have to look at it, especially in the defense world. When you're talking about classified, you're going to have the same kind of regulatory scheme you already deal with, where you have foci issues and set up a proxy board of U.S. citizens that kind of screen the domestic operations from the foreign operations. But I certainly think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis because, as I mentioned before, one of our clients, we had to deal with an audit that went into, you know, everything they do, all their relations with their foreign subsidiaries or their foreign parent, and how they really conduct their business. And it was pretty much an onerous audit. And you might see that more on a case-by-case basis now. I don't know.
Lindsay, I just add to that, in the financial services world, that kind of oversight exists, and that is a part of the regulatory structure, perhaps for different reasons than you'd see in the defense world, but there is a model for that kind of oversight.
And the structure on the transportation side lends itself to evolution in that direction because, one, so many transportation companies are international today. Two, the whole rationale for federal regulation of transportation is safety. And to the extent that cybersecurity issues blend over into safety issues, and in transportation they do, in an almost comprehensive way, then that leaves that door, I think, very wide open over time for ever more activity, regulatory activity that creeps across the border, in effect.
Great. Any other questions? Well, great, thanks. I want to thank everyone on behalf of myself and my colleagues and partners. I want to thank you for joining us today for today's panel discussion, both in person and by webinar. We hope the speakers from government in the first panel and the Venable speakers in the second panel provided some valuable insight regarding the anticipated impact of the executive order, specifically on the energy, defense, financial industries or financial services and transportation industries, as well as some other industries based on the comments. We look forward to continuing the dialogue as the cybersecurity framework is developed and implemented. Venable lawyers expect to track and actively participate in the NIST workshops, and will be drafting requests for information responses on behalf of our clients. Today's presentation will be available on Venable's website, along with additional information regarding Venable's Cybersecurity Practice Group, including recent client alerts and other publications regarding cybersecurity matters. Thanks again for joining us, and please feel free to follow up with any of the Venable speakers or any of the members of our Cybersecurity Practice Group if you have any additional questions or comments.